I think there's someone who might be listening to us talk and feel like, okay, that's great, but that you guys are talking about something I can't afford to consider. This idea of worth it, like I'm so locked into survival mode of paying my bills. I may not have the best job. Obviously, the first job isn't our last job, but I feel stuck and I can't even afford to think about worth it. How do we speak to that person right now that's just feeling buried, going, they're ready to, maybe they already have, they've just selected a whole nother episode or podcast because they're like, yeah, I can't afford the worth it right now.
So they're not going to hear all of this
They're
advice.
not going to hear any of this
ready
advice. But what do we do there? You know, because I think that's a real person we're trying to reach.
We'll say necessity is the mother of invention. I always want to ask the question, who's the father? Because it's a very specific metaphor. There's a mother involved, absolutely. But who's the father? And I think it's the right way to build the metaphor, because it is impossible for a woman to have a child and not know it. It is possible for a man to have a child and not know it. It's a very different relationship between these two. So the mother of necessity, that's the right way to say that. Because we often start our journey needing to do something. We need to make money. There's a drive of have to. And when you're in the have to, you're in the have to. You have to go to work. I don't like my job, but I have to go to work. Okay, great. But if you get caught there and you live your whole life from that mode, you'll never find the get to, right? And that's the father of the whole. You won't spend any time at all sitting with yourself to figure out, why am I going down this road? Where does this road take me? And the sooner you can start to get that get to thing cooking, the better. When you look back at people who have been successful, they have huge swaths of their life that were driven by have to and necessity, and they just gutted it out. But the whole time they were doing, not the whole time, at some point in that time, they also started to learn something about themselves, and they started to apply that. And that thing that's inside of you that is capable of showing up in increasingly powerful ways can eventually change the tide and turn this thing into something else. There are very few people, even people of great means, who don't get stuck in the have to at some point. It might not be a financial have to, but it's I have to satisfy the legacy of my family, or I have to go to this school. There's all kinds of have tos that people get stuck in, and it's the same feeling of stuck. Sure, they have more money, so that's better. But in terms of the inner psychology, they're just as stuck. One of the most significant books on this subject was written by Viktor Frankl, and it's called Man's Search for Meaning. And he wrote that book from an experience in the concentration camps in Germany. And he watched people's humanity be stripped from them. So the very essence of being completely lost, stuck, stripped away in the worst possible kind of jail and the worst kind of oppression you could ever imagine. And it crushed most people. But one of the things he walked out of that experience with was an understanding that even when all that's been confined and crushed and contained and stripped away, there was still something else ticking. And that if you could access that, you could survive and you could find meaning even in this experience. He called it a will to meaning. And he actually referred to it as spiritual freedom in one of his writings. And so even when we get ourselves locked into all this have to, when we get profoundly stuck and trapped and our freedoms are taken and we're oppressed, well, what's interesting is some of the best work on freedom, which this book is, have been written from jail cells. Because it's where we get the letters from Brigham Jail from Martin Luther King Jr., and we get Bonhoeffer's work, and we get like half the New Testament. And it's these people who found themselves completely oppressed and squished and stuck and yet still found something else. They still found the get to. I still get to show up this way. It's profoundly difficult. I'm not saying there's anything easy about that. It is possible.
Right.
And if you begin to build that aptitude or that behavior or that mindset, or if you just, a spark of that can be this correction, this shift that has all of these external consequences over time, almost no effect today, right? There's no results when that mindset starts to shift. But over time, if you consistently lean into that, I have a client. I know I'm ranting right now, but I love this subject. I have a client who he made a decision a few years ago. He had a heart surgery. Like he was killing himself. He was dying and he couldn't move. He was a middle-aged man, but he was old, right? That's how he tells this story. And he'd gotten to this spot where he just wasn't functioning well. He decided, it's about 6 years ago, to change that. And it's little things along the way. And I met him a couple years later, and we did some things. And then he started doing some work with some other folks, and they've taken him over here. And then he's back in my life doing this thing with me over here. And I'm just watching him make these shifts in his life. And the early shifts were small little things, but they're huge now. It's huge what he's doing. And if you looked at his bank account, it's probably the same. But if you look at his life, it's completely different. Mm-hmm. He's repairing old wounds. He's fixing old relationships. He is serving the community in ways that are incredible. And it's just that little internal will to meaning. And he started to shift, and he started to find his get to, and he started to change his thoughts. And he's saving his life right now. The person who says, I can't afford to think about worth it right now, is thinking about cash. But there's 3 activatable resources we have in our lives. We have cash, money, we have time, and that person might not even have time, but attention. We spend attention. And where you pay attention forms the reality in which you live. And that's something that takes no extra cash and no extra time to pay attention to something different. It's, I think, one of the most powerful things we spend. It's very limited of how much of it we have. And where you put that is probably the key to that kind of a question. Mm-hmm. We look at people who have all the money and all the time. They've done all that work, but they're still paying attention to the wrong things. They'll still be just as trapped and lost, or differently trapped and lost. So that's the first resource that someone can activate. I think it's probably the most powerful one that often leads to what feels like more time and sometimes leads to more money.
Yeah. I like that too when you say pay attention, because I wouldn't necessarily think of that in rank with like time and money. Mm-hmm. But you can, it's the idea that you could be somewhere with your time and not really present there. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right, I was there, but I wasn't there.
Mm-hmm. What were you paying attention to?
What was I paying attention to? It's like, hey,
come back. Attention to worry and loss, and
come back to the room, right? But man, I mean, I think that's something too. If you're in a space right now where you might feel, because we all have these moments, like I just can't afford to go there, and I just got to grind it. I got to get it done, whatever. Pay attention to those indicators, because compliance, pressure. You know, this thing in us that wants to revolt on the inside, you know, I'm going to obey you, or I'm going to do this on the outside in a very professional manner, but inside I'm just kicking and screaming. Mm-hmm. Those are indicators. If we pay attention to those and just take little notes, they might lead us to some of those places of what is worth it, because this is clearly not worth it.
Right.
And those are the signs that we can pay attention to.